All this week, France 24 is bringing you a special series of reports from the United Kingdom. Brexit and the war in Ukraine are pushing the cost of living ever higher, with energy bills skyrocketing. Britain's also now experiencing the largest wave of strikes in a generation. Joining me now on set, the person behind that special series this week, Clovis Casali. Hi, Clovis. Thanks for coming on the set. What was it like for you shooting this series? You said it wasn't the easiest shoot to do.
Surprisingly difficult, it has to be said. We struggled really to get through to nurses, doctors and paramedics, not because they didn't want to talk, but because we had to get validation, if you will, from the hospital's communications department for these employees to be able to speak freely. And when the hospitals agreed, we couldn't mention their names. We had to remain rather vague on a certain number of information. So it was pretty difficult, but thankfully people like Steve agreed to let us film. Steve, who's a paramedic who we followed.
Indeed. And we showed that episode a little bit earlier in the hour. That's broadcasting throughout the day today on France 24. Tell us a bit more about the situation for the paramedics specifically. What's it like for them? Well,
the paramedics are part of the NHS in a way, because they are the ones bringing the patients from the homes to hospitals, and there are record delays outside hospitals. And the paramedics we've met just feel completely disillusioned by the situation. They say there's not enough staff, simply not enough staff to be able to deliver the proper care needed for patients. And then there's the issue, of course, of salaries not high enough with the current inflation. So NHS unions are asking for roughly 19% pay rise. They could settle over 10%. What we do know is that we are currently experiencing in the United Kingdom strikes, mass strikes, unseen in a generation. And in February, you'll have huge strikes for the first time. For instance, paramedics and nurses on strike at the same time.
You're talking to all different kinds of people who we'll be seeing throughout the week in this series on France 24. I want to ask you particularly about the teachers that you spoke to.
Indeed, we went to Bristol to meet with Ewan, who's a learning assistant. So he's not quite a professor, but he does the same thing. He works in a working class area in a very difficult school with kids, with children who have disabilities, who have various problems, sometimes from foster families. And he is there working full time and really struggling to make ends meet. Let's take a listen. He gives us an idea of his life, of his salary, and you're going to see it's very tough.
My monthly salary is a bit over £1,000. Previously, I'd be paid rent where it could be 500. With bills, it comes to 800, 700. So that leaves you sometimes around about 200 quid, maybe for food, doctors, anything like that. We're all writing our CVs at the moment. You stay because of the students. I don't want to abandon my students. They're kids who haven't done anything wrong. They have learning difficulties, or they happen to be from a certain background.
Clovis, one of the teachers that you spoke to in that shoot in Bristol. Tell us a bit more about Ewan and his story.
He's soon turning 30 and he's really struggling. So he has to go to food banks at times. £200, that's around €250 or even less, to live with every month. So, of course, he doesn't really go out much to the pub, to the cinema with his friends, and it's very difficult. I asked him, why aren't you leaving this job? Why aren't you getting something a bit more lucrative? He's got a master's in English literature. He said, because if I don't do this job, who will be doing this job? These kids need help. He thinks that the public sector is completely abandoned by the authorities, and that's why he wants to stay in that job, but he's going to have to leave because he just needs to find a life. There's another interesting point raised by another teacher we met and who we'll see in a next report. He says it's very unfair. You look at teachers who are 50 years old now. They, at the time, with their salaries, had enough to be able to buy a flat, buy a house. That's no longer the case for our generation. It's not just the case in the UK. It's the case in many other countries. Teachers struggling to have that role in society and that purchasing power they once had.
So this week you're going to be talking to paramedics, to teachers. What are the other stories you'll be telling us throughout the week?
Well, we looked at an institution in the UK, pubs pubs, independent pubs, closing. Why? Because with Brexit, lack of workforce, they're struggling to retain personnel, and there's the rising cost of energy. Someone in the newsroom told me she just came back from the UK, spent holidays with a family, a wealthy family. Usually they pay £5,000, and that's a lot. Electricity bills, now it's £3,000 a month. So you can imagine they're not putting their heaters on. Imagine for poor people. We met one lady, a single mum, who told us that she had to put on the heater for a few hours the day before. It cost her £5. She can't afford that. £5 is what she'd spend per day on food. That's one of the stories. The pubs closing, and also the new poors, if you will, those who've been plunged in poverty because of the energy crisis, because of living costs, and who are really now relying on food banks.
All right, Clovis, thanks so much for that and for your reporting. And you can follow that series all week on France 24, that series taking a look at what the state is like for people in the UK and in England today as those massive strikes are getting underway, the biggest strikes in a generation.